You've come to a point in your life where you realized you were living for everyone, less for you. Think with me for a second. You say yes when you mean no. You change your mind at the last minute because someone frowned. You sleep late answering messages from people who wouldn't even care about you if you disappeared for a week. You squirm, you mold, you erase yourself, all to make sure no one is disappointed in you. And the worst, you think that's kindness. You have been taught to call it love. But let me ask you a question that perhaps no one has ever asked you with this clarity. What if God is destroying you from the inside precisely to free you from this? I know this phrase bothers me, but stay with me. There's a scene in the Bible that most people know by heart but never really saw. It is the scene of Peter at the most critical moment of Jesus' life, that cold night in the courtyard of the high priest. Bonfire lit, soldiers around, and Peter, the man who had promised, "I will die with you," turns 3 times to an ordinary woman, a doorkeeper, a slave, and denies it. I don't know this man. Now tell me, was Peter a coward? Maybe a little. But before judging you, think about one thing. How many times have you denied who you are just so you don't create confusion? How many times have you swallowed your voice so that someone would continue to like you? How many times have you betrayed your own values at a family dinner, a work meeting, a relationship, just to keep the peace? Pedro was so used to pleasing, so used to performing who people wanted him to be, that when fear hit, instinct was not courage. It was conformity. And God let him, not because he didn't care, but because he knew that Peter would only be transformed into the apostle he needed to be after going through the shame of that moment. Sometimes God doesn't protect you from your fall. He lets you fall completely because it's on the ground that you finally stop trying to impress and start being real. That's what this video is about. It's not about becoming a selfish, cold person who doesn't care about anyone. It's about something much deeper and honestly much scarier. It's about the painful, liberating and downright transformative process that happens when God decides the time has come for you to stop living on the approval of others. And this process is not kind. He doesn't send flowers. He doesn't send a warning email. He begins to remove. People who depended on your emotional obedience begin to complain. Relationships that only worked because you never disagreed start to crack. The job you could handle in silence starts to become unbearable. The anxiety you thought was normal starts screaming, and you'll think something is wrong with you. But what if everything is right? What if just that? This discomfort, this silent collapse of the structures you've built to be loved by everyone, is God's hand at work. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you 6 things that happen when God begins this process in your life. Each one of them will recognize you, and at least one will make you stop the video, take a deep breath and think, how did he know that about me? So stay. Because what comes next can change the way you see every relationship, every choice, and every yes you gave with a heavy heart. The day you get tired of being everyone's favorite doormat. There comes a day, and you'll know exactly which day I'm talking about, when something inside you just snaps. It's not dramatic. There's no big explosion, no screaming match, no cinematic moment where you flip a table and walk out in slow motion. It's quieter than that. It's a Tuesday afternoon, or a Sunday after church, or 2 a.m. when you're lying in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying a conversation where, once again, you said yes when every cell in your body was screaming no. And something in you whispers, I can't keep doing this. That whisper, that's not weakness. That's not ingratitude. That's not rebellion against God. That's God. The Bible introduces us to a man named Gideon, hiding in a winepress, threshing wheat in secret so the Midianites wouldn't take it from him. He was small, scared, and invisible by choice, because invisible felt safe. And then an angel shows up and says something that must have sounded absolutely insane to Gideon. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon's response is basically, "Have you got the right address?" And here's what's fascinating from a psychological standpoint. Gideon wasn't just physically hiding. He had internalized smallness. He had made peace with irrelevance because relevance felt dangerous. The moment you become visible, you become a target. The moment you have an opinion, someone might not like it. The moment you say no, someone might leave. So you stay in the winepress. You stay manageable. You stay safe. But here's what nobody tells you about people-pleasing. It's exhausting in a way that sleep can't fix. You can get 8 hours and wake up depleted because the drain isn't physical. It's existential. You are spending your life energy managing other people's emotions, and that is a full-time job that pays nothing and costs everything. Psychologists call this self-abandonment. It's when your instinct to regulate other people's feelings becomes stronger than your instinct to honor your own. You become so skilled at reading the room, anticipating reactions, softening your words, shrinking your needs, that eventually you lose track of what you actually want, think, or feel. Not because someone took it from you, because you gave it away, one small compromise at a time, until there was nothing left to give. And the cruelest part, people liked you better that way. They called you humble. They called you easygoing. They called you sweet. And every compliment reinforced the cage. But God doesn't call you sweet. God calls you a warrior. The tiredness you feel isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that something is finally waking up. Your soul was not designed to be a service counter for everyone else's emotional needs. You were not created to be endlessly available, endlessly agreeable, endlessly moldable. Jesus himself, the most loving human being who ever lived, said no. He withdrew from crowds. He told people not to share his miracles. He flipped tables in the temple. He looked the Pharisees dead in the eye and told them they were whitewashed tombs. He loved people completely and still refused to be managed by them. That day, when you get tired, that's not you becoming selfish. That's you becoming honest. And honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is always the beginning of something God can actually work with. When God starts removing people, you are killing yourself to keep. Nobody prepares you for this part. You do the inner work. You start reading, praying, going to therapy, journaling at midnight. You start to understand the patterns, why you apologize when someone bumps into you, why you feel anxious when someone doesn't text back immediately, why you need to be liked by everyone in the room, including people you don't even like. And then, just when you think you're getting better, the losses start. Someone pulls away. A friendship that felt permanent starts to feel strained. A family member becomes cold. A relationship that survived a decade starts cracking under the weight of the new version of you. The one who has opinions, the one who says, "Actually, that doesn't work for me," the one who stopped laughing at jokes made at your expense. And your first instinct is to panic and go back to who you were. Don't. Here's the truth that will hurt before it heals. Some people in your life were not there because they loved you. They were there because you were useful. Not useful in a transaction sense, but useful in an emotional sense. You were the one who never pushed back. You were the one who absorbed tension. You were the one who made everyone feel okay by making yourself invisible. When you stop doing that, the dynamic breaks. And some people, not all but some, cannot handle a version of you that has a spine. In the book of John, chapter 6, Jesus delivers what scholars call the hard teaching. He talks about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, deeply symbolic language that his audience took literally and found offensive. And the text says something devastating. From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. Not enemies, disciples, people who had walked with him, watched miracles, eaten from his hands, and Jesus does not chase them. He turns to the 12 and asks almost calmly, "Do you want to leave too?" This is the moment most people-pleasers cannot fathom, the willingness to let people go rather than dilute your truth to keep them comfortable. Jesus, who loved these people, let them walk because he refused to become a smaller version of himself to maintain their approval. From a psychological perspective, what happens when you start to heal from people-pleasing is called relationship restructuring. Your old relational patterns were built on an implicit contract. You give endless accommodation. They give you presence and approval. When you break the contract, some people renegotiate, but others leave because the contract was the whole relationship, and God, in his mercy, lets them go, not to punish you, not because you did something wrong, but because he knows that you cannot grow into who he made you to be while you are still performing for an audience that was only there for the performance. The empty space that those people leave is not a wound. It's a room being cleared for something real. Let it be cleared. The guilt that hits when you finally say no, and why it's a trap. You said no, maybe for the first time in years. It wasn't even a big no. It was something small. You declined an invitation. You pushed back on a request. You told someone you needed space. And the words came out of your mouth, and for one single second you felt something unfamiliar. Relief. And then, almost immediately, the guilt hit. Not guilt like you stole something, guilt like you committed a social crime, like you broke an unspoken rule that you've been following your entire life. Your chest tightens. Your mind starts running scenarios. What if they're angry? What if they think I'm selfish? What if I hurt them? Maybe I should just take it back. Maybe I should apologize. Maybe I should explain myself for 20 minutes until they feel okay again. This is the trap. And it's one of the most sophisticated traps the human psyche can build, because it uses your own conscience against you. It weaponizes your empathy. It takes the very best part of you, your capacity to care about others, and twists it into a chain. Brené Brown, in her research on shame and vulnerability, makes a distinction that changed how many people understand themselves. There is a difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says I did something bad. Shame says I am bad. And people-pleasers, when they say no, almost always experience shame, not just guilt. They don't just feel like they made a bad choice. They feel like they are a bad person. But here's where the Bible gets extraordinarily precise. Paul writes in Galatians 1:10, "Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ." That's not a gentle verse, that's a confrontation, because Paul is essentially saying you cannot serve God and your need for approval at the same time. They are, at some level, incompatible. The approval of people will always ask you to compromise the call of God, and the call of God will always ask you to disappoint someone. The guilt you feel when you say no is not the Holy Spirit convicting you. The Holy Spirit convicts you when you genuinely wrong someone, when you act in cruelty, dishonesty, or selfishness. But the Holy Spirit does not convict you for having a limit. He does not convict you for being human. He does not convict you for needing rest, for saying you're unavailable, for declining to carry what was never yours to carry. That guilt, that's conditioning. That's years of being rewarded for yes and punished, subtly, emotionally, for no. That's a nervous system that learned that your safety depends on other people's comfort. And it lies. The no that comes from a grounded, prayed-over, honest place is not sin. It is stewardship. It is you taking responsibility for the life, the energy and the calling that God put inside you, and refusing to scatter it in every direction just to avoid the discomfort of someone's disappointment. Say no, feel the guilt, and don't obey it. why your kindness was actually fear in disguise. This one is going to sting. I'm going to ask you to stay with it anyway. What if the thing you've been calling kindness was never really kindness at all? What if it was fear, wearing kindness's clothes? Think about the last time you did something generous, helped someone move, stayed late to cover for a colleague, gave money you didn't really have, bit your tongue when someone said something that genuinely hurt you. Now ask yourself honestly, if there were absolutely zero social consequences, if no one would ever know whether you helped or not, would you still have done it? Sometimes the answer is yes, and that's real kindness, freely given, no strings attached, no fear underneath it. But sometimes the answer is more complicated. Sometimes you helped because you were afraid of what they'd think if you didn't. You stayed late because saying no felt like a confrontation you weren't equipped for. You gave the money because the awkwardness of saying, "I can't right now," felt worse than the financial strain. You stayed silent because the risk of conflict felt like the risk of being rejected, and rejection, somewhere deep in your nervous system, feels like death. That's not kindness. That's conflict avoidance with excellent PR. Psychologist Dr. Susan Forward, in her work on emotional blackmail, describes a pattern she calls the fog: fear, obligation, and guilt. These three forces are the invisible engine behind most people-pleasing behavior. You're not giving because it flows naturally out of love. You're giving because the fog is thick and you can't see any other way through. And here's the spiritual dimension that makes this even more layered. This kind of fear-driven giving actually robs the other person too. Because when you give from fear, you're not really giving yourself. You're giving a performance. You're giving them the version of you that needs them to approve of you. And over time, that creates relationships built not on genuine love, but on mutual pretense. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, says something that sounds simple but is radically demanding. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. He's not just talking about honesty in communication, he's talking about integrity of the inner life, about the alignment between what you feel, what you believe, and what you do. He's describing a person who acts from the inside out, not from the outside in. Real kindness is free. It doesn't keep a tab. It doesn't get resentful at 2 a.m. It doesn't need to be acknowledged. It doesn't collapse into bitterness when the person it helped doesn't reciprocate. Fear-based giving always eventually turns into resentment. You can only give from an empty place for so long before something in you starts to harden. You start to feel used, even by people who never actually asked you to sacrifice yourself. Because they didn't ask you. You volunteered, and now you're angry that they accepted. The invitation here is not to stop being generous. The invitation is to become honest about the source, to sit with your own motivations, not with judgment, but with curiosity. To ask, am I doing this because I want to, or because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't? That question alone, asked regularly and honestly, can begin to dismantle years of fear-driven patterns and replace them with something that actually looks like the love described in 1 Corinthians 13. Patient, kind, not self-seeking, not easily angered, keeping no record of wrongs. That love is only possible when fear is no longer driving. The moment you stop performing and start existing. There is a version of you that nobody has ever met, not your parents, not your best friend, not your partner, not even you, not fully, not yet. This version doesn't scan the room before speaking, doesn't preemptively soften every opinion, doesn't laugh at things that aren't funny or agree with things that are wrong. This version has a face that matches what's happening on the inside. Gets genuinely excited about things without worrying if that excitement is too much, disagrees, takes up space, rests without guilt. This version is not who you become when you're alone. It's who you become when you're no longer afraid. The performance starts early. For most people pleasers, it begins in childhood. in families where love felt conditional, where a parent's mood determined the temperature of the entire house, where being good meant being invisible, where your needs were either ignored or labeled as burdensome. You learned, fast and young, that the way to be safe was to be what people needed you to be. That adaptation was intelligent, it was survival. It kept you emotionally alive in an environment that couldn't fully hold you. But you're not a child anymore, and the survival mechanism that protected you then is now the very thing imprisoning you. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear for the world. He wasn't describing something evil, he was describing something deeply human. We all have a persona. The problem comes when the persona becomes so thick and so practiced that we lose access to what's behind it. When the performance runs so long that the actor forgets they're acting. The Psalms are full of people who dropped the performance. David, king, warrior, anointed by God, writes things in the Psalms that no self-respecting public figure would ever post online. My God, why have you forsaken me? Lament, rage, confusion, despair, raw and unfiltered, handed directly to God without diplomatic packaging. David performed for courts, for armies, for a kingdom. But in the Psalms, he existed, and God called him a man after his own heart, not the performer. The man. The moment you stop performing and start existing is rarely a triumphant moment. It usually feels like collapse, like the scaffolding you built to hold up the version of yourself that everyone approved of is coming down, and you're standing in the rubble wondering who you are without it. That disorientation is normal. It's necessary. Identity reconstruction, which is what psychologists call this process, is one of the most uncomfortable and most important things a human being can go through. Because on the other side of that disorientation is something that most people-pleasers have never truly had. A self. Not the self you were told to be, not the self you performed to survive, but the self that God knit together before anyone had the chance to tell you who you should be instead. Existing, truly existing, is an act of courage, and it is ultimately an act of worship because it honors the specific, irreplaceable human being that God made when He made you. What real love looks like. When you're no longer desperate for approval. Here is the paradox that will take your breath away once you fully grasp it. The less you need people's approval, the more you are actually capable of loving them. That sounds backwards. It feels backwards. Everything in us assumes that the person who tries hardest to please, who bends the most, who accommodates the most, who needs the least, that person loves the most. But that's not love. That's dependency dressed as devotion. Real love. The kind described in the New Testament, the kind that Paul calls the greatest thing, the kind that Jesus demonstrates not just by dying but by living. Real love requires freedom. You cannot love freely when you are terrified of losing someone. You cannot give freely when you need something back. You cannot see someone clearly when your vision is distorted by the constant anxious question, do they still like me? Think about what happens in a relationship built on people-pleasing. One person constantly accommodates. The other, consciously or not, gets used to being accommodated. The first person can't express real needs, so resentment builds. The second person never gets challenged, so they never grow. Both are cheated. Both are stuck. And the relationship, no matter how conflict-free on the surface, is hollow underneath. Now think about what happens when someone shows up as they actually are. They say what they mean. They push back when they disagree. They express needs without apologizing for having them. They love you enough to be honest, even when honesty is uncomfortable. That's terrifying. And it's also the only kind of relationship where real intimacy is possible. Jonathan and David in the Old Testament are perhaps the greatest portrait of this kind of love. Jonathan, heir to the throne, risks everything, his inheritance, his relationship with his father, his own life, to protect David. He doesn't do it to be liked. He doesn't do it out of obligation. He does it because the love between them was, in the words of David's lament, more wonderful than the love of women. It was covenantal, costly, and completely free. Psychologist Erich Fromm wrote in The Art of Loving that immature love says, "I love you because I need you," while mature love says, "I need you because I love you." The distinction is subtle and seismic. Immature love is love as strategy. I am loving you so that I am not alone, so that I am safe, so that I am approved of. Mature love is love as choice. I see you fully, I choose you freely, and my need for you flows from the love, not the other way around. When you stop being desperate for approval, something extraordinary happens to the way you treat people. You stop managing them and start seeing them. You stop needing them to validate you and start being genuinely curious about who they are. You can hear hard things without falling apart. You can disagree without it meaning the relationship is over. You can love someone and still tell them the truth, which is, in the end, the deepest form of respect one human being can offer another. And here is where it comes full circle, back to where this whole conversation began. God is not trying to make you cold. He is not trying to make you isolated, self-sufficient, or indifferent to the people around you. The deconstruction of people-pleasing is not the destruction of love. It is the beginning of it. Because only the person who knows they are fully loved by God, not for their performance, not for their usefulness, not for how little space they take up, but simply completely unconditionally. Only that person can love others without needing anything in return. You were not made to perform, you were made to love, and those two things, it turns out, cannot coexist.